The one-room exhibit at the Campbell House may not be large, but the stories it tells shed light on a little-known aspect of this St. Louis Gilded Age family. They are the stories of the servants who worked for the Campbells in the 19th and 20th centuries.
This first panel here tells the story of those 19th century servants. They're a group of people who were primarily immigrants from places like Ireland and Germany, who came to work here, typically for only a few years at a time.
The domestic staff of the 20th century tended to be American-born, and they stayed a lot longer. But the most intriguing section of the exhibit centers on a woman in the household whose existence was uncovered during research over the past decade. Her name was Eliza Rone, an African-American and a slave.
We don't know how she came to St. Louis. She was born in Virginia. We don't know how the Campbells came to own her. But what we do know is by the late 1840s, she's probably enslaved by the Campbells here in St. Louis. When they move into the Campbell House here in 1854, Eliza comes with them.
So what was Rone's role in the Campbell household? A court document indicates she was a washerwoman. But at some point, Rone was entrusted with the care of Robert and Virginia Campbell's children.
Unlike the other domestics who are talked about in this exhibit, Eliza was the nanny, which in many ways made her closer than any other domestic. Now, part of that reason is she didn't have her freedom, and so she couldn't leave or quit. But at the same time, she did have somewhat of a privileged role in this house as the nanny. Before 1857, we know that the Campbells regularly traveled east, and Eliza was the nanny. We know that Eliza was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where there was no such thing as slavery. But here she's brought along as part of the Campbells' property. And the Campbells wouldn't have been unusual in doing that necessarily. Eliza saw a lot of different things. I wonder what she felt like walking the streets of Philadelphia, where she knew that there was no such thing as slavery in Pennsylvania. And yet here she was, owned by the Campbells. She couldn't control her own destiny, and what that must have felt like her to come back to St. Louis. In some ways, we think she felt good about coming back to St. Louis because her husband was here. He was not owned by the Campbells. He lived here as a free man. And so I'm sure that impacted her thinking.
In any event, in January of 1857, Robert Campbell freed Eliza Rone and her 2 young sons.
The first real concrete evidence, and that gave us Eliza a last name, was her emancipation record. And that's what's shown here on this panel. Here on the bottom is an enlarged version of the Circuit Court Ledger Book, which notes Robert Campbell coming into open court and acknowledging that he has executed a deed of emancipation for a young woman named Eliza, along with her 2 small children. The next day it appears in the newspaper, and that's what this is, noting basically the same thing that happened in court.
To put Eliza Rone's emancipation into historical perspective, it happened at a time when hundreds of Missouri slaves, many of them women, were filing so-called freedom suits in court and winning. And just a few months after Rone's emancipation, the United States Supreme Court handed down a ruling in which Dred Scott was denied his bid for freedom. That fateful decision was a key factor in sparking the Civil War. Rone continued to work for the Campbells as a paid employee after gaining her freedom.
When Mrs. Campbell dies in 1882, she leaves 2 bequests in her will. One to her sister, her only sister, and one to Eliza. And we think this speaks to a kind of a very unique relationship.
Following the end of the Civil War in the late 1860s, John and Eliza Rone settled their family in Kansas City, Missouri, where many of their descendants still live. Eliza Rone died in 1923. The image of Eliza Rone you see in the exhibit is not a likeness of her, but an imagining of what she may have looked like based on written descriptions. The Campbell House is hoping one day to obtain a photograph of Rone through one of her descendants.
We've been welcoming people here for a long time. We've been telling the story. You think, what else can possibly be new?
But the discoveries continue. For Living St. Louis, I'm Ruth Ezel.